Hi everyone, it's Lolita and this is the demo video for how to mix mutes. Hope you enjoy and learn something. So we're going to start on our mutes, tones, neutrals chart. And the first thing we're going to paint on this is we're going to paint mutes. And now what a mute is a color plus its complementary. So if you take a color and then add its complementary, so color plus complementary makes a mute. So color plus complementary makes a mute. And that is what we're going to start working with now. And I've already pre-mixed, or not so much pre-mixed, in as much as set out all of the colors that we're working with today. And what we're going to be working with today is we're going to start with red, yellow, blue, and then we're going to use green, violet, and orange. And going back to our kit, the same violet, green, and orange that we used for the tint chart, we're going to use those same colors for our mute chart. We're going to move on to tones and neutrals, but first we're going to just work on mutes. And what we want to do here is, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to paint in that first rectangle here, and we're going to paint it in with the base color. And the base color is just going to be the color that we're using with absolutely none of its complement added in. Yeah, I feel like I should have put a paper underneath here so I could not be so afraid of going to the edge. So we're just painting in that first color, trying to paint it in, get it in as even as possible, remembering that idea of going in with a live edge. I can't swear I did the best job here because I was too busy thinking about talking and not as much about painting. And so that's what happens here with some of my videos. So let's and plus I was also very worried about that edge. I'm going to go back in and do something of a live edge and get my paint to move over physically and be a lot more even toned the way I want the value and saturation of my red to be. And I feel what it can be. I see some of the paint floating on top of the surface, and I like to try to pick some of that up. Just go in there and pick some of it up, move it around, and see if I can just physically move it around on my paper to get it to settle in more. So now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in some of the complement for red. So to mute a color, you mix it with its complementary. And as we know, a color's complementary is the color directly across or opposite from it on the 12 color wheel. And we all know this because we've already been working with the 12 color wheel. And I've got one right here. And so that means we're going to take some of this green and mix a little bit of it into our red to just mute that red down just a little bit. So I'm going to take a little bit more green and mix it in and pull a little bit more of this red over off here to the side. And we can see I've already started muting my red, and what that means is this red is no longer as saturated and bright and pure as it was before. So I'm going to paint that into my second box right here. And I'm going to go from red all the way over to green. So in this first box, I've only got just a little green in there. And I'm going to try to use that idea of painting into that live edge, trying to get a nice even wash, not letting that edge dry up too much, so this way I can still manipulate the paint and get it to flow into the next passage, from one passage to the next. And if I just go into that area where I've got a nice simulation of a bead, then it allows me to get a little bit more of an even tone throughout the area that I'm painting. And again, while I was talking, I feel like I made my tone a little uneven, so I'm going back and just gently brushing over the surface of that area to even that paint out just a little more than it was. Okay, and I can even move that around and shake it around and get it to settle a little bit more in the paint. So I'm going to take even more of this green over here, and you see I cleaned my brush up because I don't want to contaminate my green, and I'm going to add more of that green into the previous mixture that I had already mixed up with a little bit of the green and the red in my kit. And I'm pulling a little bit more of that red out, and we can see here that I'm getting quite a brown tone, mute. So I'm going to put that into the next rectangle. So this one has just slightly more green in it than the previous version of a mute. And here we are muting those reds. I'm going to go back in and pick up more paint. Try to get this one a little bit more even. You can see that it's getting a little on the brown side. So this allows you to understand what happens when you, not only what colors you get when you mute, but what the actual term for muting it is. And of course, we now know that term is to mute when you add a color's complement to it. So a color plus its complement, that's how you mute it. And so that's with a little more green in it than the previous rectangle. And again, go back in and clean that brush up. Make sure it does not have any red in it when I put it back in that green. And I'm going to put more green in. And I'm just going to add that into the mixture that I already previously had put down, because there's just no reason to not just keep adding green in increments to see what happens. So I'm going to put this down, and we see we get almost a gray brown out of these particular pigments. Just keep in mind that these are the mutes that these particular pigments produce when they're mixed. Every pigment, just because it's called a red or a green, it won't produce this exact color. It will look similar, and you'll be able to extrapolate, but you're going to have to extrapolate when you mix colors and understand you're going to come up with a variation of these colors when you use other brands and when you mix other reds or greens together. So just understand that this is the red and the green we get with these specific combinations. And you can expand outside of that. So now we're going to add just even more green into that mixture of red and green. And it's almost gone green. We get a really nice olive green color down here at the end. And I can choose to be happy with that, or I can decide to add a little more green in. And that really is just like a visual call that you can make. But you also just want to remember to what degree you added more green, or what your green to red ratio is. So that way you keep in mind what it is you get when you mix these different colors. So look here at the end, we get this really nice olive green coming out of the mix. Just gonna go back in and load my brush in some more. I'm using my number 4 brush in here. You can use your number 4 round, or even your number 6 round. Either of the brushes will work, whichever one you're more comfortable with. I probably would advise against using the flat brushes, and definitely advise against using the teeny tiny brushes or brush. So I got a little piled up too much there in the corner, and I'm going to try to moderate that just a little by offloading some of that pigment from my brush and having my brush just a little teeny tiny bit moist when I go back in and try to move that, manipulate it around to try to even out that color in there, that lovely muted green. So I can move that just from side to side. And again, I'm just brushing this over the surface really delicately to try to manipulate the tone. All right, looks like we are ready to mix up our next mute. And what I'm going to do here, everybody, is I'm just going to mix up I've already got my yellow pre-mixed. I'm not sure if I am going to go all the way through and mix up all of these tones, all these new, not tones rather, but the new mutes for you. Let's see, I think I'm definitely going to go in and mix the yellow and the blue, and then after that I'll stop and analyze and see whether or not I'm going to mix the rest of those up for you. So going in with the yellow, and we know that the yellow, this particular pigment, it goes on really nice. And you see I've already pre-labeled each of mine, so I put red up here, yellow here, blue, green, violet, orange. Helps me stay organized and lets me know what my plan is. So I'm going in with the yellow, just a pure yellow, again, just establishing what that baseline is. And using that same idea, I'm going to put this over here on the side to catch the excess paint that I push over here to the side of my paper. Go back into that wet area in my palette and push that nice lovely yellow around in that area of the rectangle that I've designated for the baseline of the yellow. And so we're going to start adding, just slowly adding in a little bit of purple to this, and you can see that yellow is a very cooperative color when it comes to going down evenly on the surface. It behaves really nicely. So I'm going to go in and wet the purple a little, the violet. And I'm just wetting just a little teeny tiny bit of it, working a little bit of it out. I don't want to overpower my yellow too fast. I already know that I can tell just from the values of the two different hues sitting here that the purple is going to be a very overpowering color. So I'm going to take that and just only make sure I just mix in just a little bit at a time, so that way it does not overwhelm my yellow. And I've got just a little bit of it mixed in, and I see that it's already muted the yellow just a little. Let's see what that looks like when I put that down in the rectangle next to the baseline yellow. And it has just a slightly more quieter yellow. It's not quite as bright as the pure yellow straight out of the palette, straight out of that pan without it being mixed, the way straight out of the factory. And so I'm just keeping these edges wet over here too, and keeping an eye on them visually to make sure that I'm going to have the room to go back in and work those edges. Otherwise, I'm not going to paint so wildly if I know I don't have sufficient time to get back in there before those edges dry. So now we're just going to add a little bit more of that violet, and again, you see I clean my brush in between so I don't mess up my little puddles of, and when I say mess up, I mean contaminate. So I'm just going to add a little bit of this violet in over here to the side again, and I think I'm going to bleach a little bit more of this yellow out of this pile of yellow that I've pulled out previously, and I'm just bleaching a little bit of it out. But this is dry over here, so, and we know that this isn't going to go back in too much into that dry pile, so I feel fairly safe playing around with what looks like a dangerous palette, but it's not quite as dangerous as it looks. So we can see here that it's getting a little bit more brown. So it's telling us a little bit that when we mix yellow and violet together, we're going to get a brown color out of it. And we can get this really, it's like this rich yellow brown, just a really rich color. I find it to be rich anyway, where it's just, for me, it has a just a nice value to it, a nice color. I really like the color, that nice rich brown where it doesn't fall flat. I find it to be active. It activates the surface. I find it to be a little richer, and that's what I mean is active and vibrant to the eye. I find it to be a little bit more of a vibrant brown than just a brown that you might, like an umber. So let's get some more of that yellow pushed out so we have more yellow and purple pigment mixing together, more of the actual pigments mixing together, so we can get maybe a little bit of a deeper value to our brown by not using such tints of the colors. So yes, you can get tints of mutes. So here we go, adding a little bit more of that purple into the brown. And I'm not quite sure I have enough in this little side pile over here to go and complete the this entire next rectangle. So I'm going to pull a little bit more paint out, put a little bit more purple in here, and again, just play dangerously close with that yellow there and push some of that yellow into the pile. So this way I've got a nicer mix, got a little bit more pigment in it, and it's enough that I know it's going to go into, fit into that rectangle that I've got designated for my next mute, where I'm just gradually adding in more violet into that yellow. We see here, gives us almost a really rich brown gold. And again, what I mean by rich is I find it just visually appealing to the eye, where this brown does not fall flat down into the surface of the paper. It's vibrant and is just a real beautiful, energetic brown. So again, we added in the violet, and just a real quick review, the reason we added in the violet is because on the 12 color wheel, violet is opposite yellow on the color wheel. So that is why we added in that violet. So now we're going to add just in a little bit more violet, and we might as well just go and take that straight into that little side pile that we've got here, and mix in a lot more violet into that violet and yellow little mixture we have there. You can see I need to activate the paint just a little more so that way I can pick up enough pigment to get that pigment moved over. And now I've got a fairly dark brown that's going towards violet in its undertone. So when we talk about undertones, we can see that the undertone of these are slightly changing, where we go from a color where we've got red is the base tone, red is still the undertone. This one here looks at primarily as a red undertone, and when we start adding more of the green in, we get into, it actually looks like more of a green undertone. And then in our fifth of our yellow and purple, we're going to go ahead and put in this last tone that we mixed up. And I think in this last tone, for me, this is the first, and I'm saying tone, but I really should be saying mute. So in this last color that we've mixed up, this last mute that we've mixed up, I really do feel like the undertone is where we finally got the undertone much more violet than the previous mixtures came out. And I'm just going to unload some of that from my brush again to moderate it, to fill that and not have so much paint that I am unhappy with the distribution of it across the surface. All right, looks like we've got our yellow mute, 5 mutes completed. And again, we see that undertone where there is yellow, and that's our base color. And this is definitely still a color where it's got yellow undertones, and I feel this has primarily yellow undertones, but when I added enough violet, we started moving into the range of having violet undertones in our mixture. So now we're going to move to the blue, and obviously we have been working with color enough now that we know the opposite of blue is orange. And what do you know, I just made those conveniently located opposite each other also in my palette wells here. So I'm just going to turn this around my palette to access my blue and my orange a little more readily. And I'm going to move some of my blue out over here to the side. I've got some of it wet over here. I'm going to move that over here to the side to get that, my blue well active, and my orange well is still a little relatively active. I'm mixing out or rather washing these out, and this water's still clean, so I feel fairly safe to just introduce that into my well and know I'm not going to contaminate my little puddle of blue here. So I'm going with that now, and I've got my base of blue here, and I'm going to paint my baseline of blue here in my first rectangle. And again, notice that because it's the baseline of blue, the primary undertone and is in fact blue. And still with each little rectangle, we're keeping that idea of that live edge going. Since we're painting flat, for the most part, I imagine most of us are going to be painting flat. And because we're painting flat, just keeping that idea of the live edge going. If you were to paint a little more formally, you might have yourself a bead. And you see that I removed some of that paint from my brush, maybe a little prematurely. And that's just part of moderating the paint as I go. And this blue's playing fairly friendly with the paper. I'm just going to move it around, just a little physically manipulate it so it actually settles into the fibers of the paper just a little more evenly. And again, that's just playing with the physics. So now we're going to add a little bit of the orange into the blue and see what happens when we add a little bit of orange into blue. And with this particular orange, we can already see that we're getting something of a lavender happening with this particular orange and blue combination. So here we go, and we're going to just put that muted blue into the rectangle next to that baseline blue. Adding that in. Yeah, so this still has an undertone of blue to it. And maybe it even has an undertone of violet by now. So I would say the undertone has already shifted in this particular combination of pigments to being more of a violet undertone. Again, washing my brush off and getting a little bit more of the paint going, this orange paint going in the, so it's a little more wet, just reactivating it. I'm going to mix that into the corner of my mixture down here, and I feel that this paint, it's very saturated, the blue and the orange, so I feel that by not even having to mix a ton of paint the way I did with the yellows, I am going to be able to have it go a lot farther than the larger puddles did. And again, just having an understanding of how much paint I need to fill this area allows me to be somewhat not as gives me some freedom to work with that live edge while it's still live. All right, and we see here we're getting a little bit of an orange undertone in this mute, and I'm going to add even more orange to this area, and I think I'm going to clean my brush off and add even more orange because my blue is fairly active in this corner, and so it is leaching into that area a little more. And it's also there's a slight angle to my table, apparently. All right, so let's go in and see what adding that much more orange does to the color. So this is a very brown color where we're getting into, but it's also another really rich brown where we've got really nice almost red undertones coming from the orange and the red in the orange. And these almost wind up looking very similar to each other. So I'm just going to take a little bit more orange and put that back into this corner here. And that's going to be my last little pile that I mix up for blues. And I'm going to put that in as my last mute of blue. And this one is with a boatload of orange in it, so we see that it's definitely got that lovely orange undertone to it where it almost looks rust. I'm going to see I'm knocking some of that paint off of my brush because I can see from that live edge puddle I've got going there that I'm going to have enough paint to move throughout this area. And so instead of piling more paint into there, I'm going to cover the surface really nicely and not have loads of paint left over. All right, so those are the mutes for the primary colors. I am going to mix up the mutes for the secondary colors, but I want you guys to, you're going to mix those up on your own. I'm not going to give you a demo of those, but what I will do is I will put my baseline in for you. So I would have, again, my baseline of green. Let me put this back under here because I don't want to get my watercolor board here dirty. So putting in my baseline of green in the first rectangle, and again using that idea of how much I know I'm able to control my paint and not going too far out of my skill range. So I want you guys to stay within your skill range when you're thinking about moving these colors really fast. If you want to get really nice even washes, think about moving them a little slower. So that's going to be my baseline for my green. And the green I would do the same, where I would start adding a little bit of red into it, and I would expect that I'm going to get some relative reverse of this here. And so let's see, then I'm also going to have my baseline for my violet, and I'm just taking some of my violet and activating that out here, and I'm going to paint in my baseline for my violet. And again, knowing how much pigment it's going to take to fill this rectangle, I make sure that I have enough in my palette so that I can use that same pigment throughout the area I intend for a specific color to be. So I know I can wipe that off of my brush now and just wipe that straight into the paper. towel over here I have off to the side. And now then the last color I'm going to put in is going to be this straight orange. And this is fairly wet over here. So I'm just going to take that orange and put that into my last control rectangle. So this is my control rectangle, what my baseline is for the color that I used to mute. So we know with the orange I'm going to be adding blue in to mute that orange. We can see how nicely orange behaves too. It must be because it has so much yellow in it that it behaves really nicely. You see how it just goes down really evenly, very readily. Orange and yellow watercolors like to play nice. Got a little too overzealous with knocking some of that pigment off my brush. Just load it with a little bit more and pull it down into that rectangle. All right, so you guys will mix some red into your green. Start taking some of your little red and mix that into your green over here. And slowly paint these in till you have more and more red and you go from green and keep muting it until you get to red, a reddish tone where you have primarily red, just the same way I did with all of these other mutes here. And so you're going to mute your 3 secondaries as well. Now the next video I'm going to give you guys is going to be for tones, and then we'll do neutrals. But what we're going to do is we're going to work from this same palette for each of them. So see you in the next video.